Paul Hogan's scandal, tax battle, 180 millionaires claim, and exile years. He was the man who made the world love Australia, whose infectious grin and easy charm had opened hearts and wallets across every continent. Paul Hogan stood at the pinnacle of global stardom, beloved by millions, wealthy beyond imagination, and respected as his nation's greatest cultural ambassador. But behind the laughter and the legend, a storm was brewing that would strip away everything he had built and force him to confront the darkest chapter of his extraordinary life. This is the untold story of Paul Hogan's spectacular fall from grace, a scandal so devastating it would destroy his reputation, bankrupt his legacy, and drive him into exile from the very country that had once celebrated him as a hero. From tax investigators circling like vultures to family betrayals that cut deeper than any knife, this is the raw, unvarnished truth about how quickly fame can turn to infamy and how the system can destroy even its greatest success stories. What really happened behind the headlines? Who was telling the truth in the battle between Australia's most beloved entertainer and the relentless machinery of government investigation? And how does a man rebuild his life when everything he thought he knew about loyalty, justice, and the price of success comes crashing down around him? Chapter 1: The Gathering Storm. In 2005, Paul Hogan's world seemed unshakable. The Crocodile Dundee franchise had generated hundreds of millions of dollars, making him one of Australia's wealthiest entertainers and most recognizable export. He lived comfortably between homes in Los Angeles and Australia, enjoying the fruits of a career that had transformed him from bridge worker to global icon. But beneath this facade of success, forces were already in motion that would soon tear his life apart. The first warning signs were subtle: routine inquiries about offshore investments, questions about film financing structures, and requests for documentation that seemed more thorough than usual. Paul's financial advisors assured him these were standard procedures, part of the increasingly complex world of international entertainment finance. Nobody suspected that these preliminary investigations would evolve into the most devastating scandal in Australian entertainment history. Around 2005, news gets out that the tax department are looking into all the profit from the Crocodile Dundee movies. Paul would later recall with obvious bitterness. Is it being placed in offshore tax havens? All that sort of stuff. They start an investigation. What began as routine compliance checks quickly escalated into something far more serious and personally destructive. The Australian Taxation Office's initial inquiries focused on the complex financial structures that had been established to manage the enormous profits from the Crocodile Dundee franchise. These arrangements, legal at the time they were implemented, involved various offshore entities and tax optimization strategies that were common practice for high-earning entertainers and international businesses. But the investigation took on a life of its own, driven by a combination of political pressure, media attention, and the irresistible appeal of targeting Australia's most famous celebrity. What had started as a technical examination of tax structures became a high-profile witch hunt that would consume years of Paul's life and millions of dollars in legal fees. The ATO alleges he owes millions of dollars of unpaid taxes, reported the media, transforming complex financial disputes into simple narratives of celebrity tax evasion. The nuanced reality of international entertainment finance was lost in sensational headlines that painted Paul as a wealthy celebrity trying to cheat the system that had made his success possible. The timing couldn't have been worse. Paul was already dealing with personal challenges, including health issues and the strain of maintaining his career in an increasingly youth-oriented entertainment industry. The tax investigation added a new layer of stress and uncertainty that would test every relationship and alliance he had built over decades of success. The investigation's scope expanded rapidly, encompassing not just the Crocodile Dundee profits, but virtually every aspect of Paul's financial life. Bank records, investment documents, property transactions, and business arrangements spanning decades were subjected to intense scrutiny by teams of investigators determined to build a case against Australia's most beloved entertainer. Paul found himself caught in a web of accusations and insinuations that seemed designed more to generate headlines than to seek justice. Every financial decision, every business arrangement, every attempt to optimize his tax obligations was reframed as evidence of criminal intent rather than prudent financial management. The psychological impact of being under constant investigation cannot be overstated. Paul went from being a celebrated national treasure to feeling like a hunted criminal, never knowing when the next subpoena would arrive or which aspect of his private life would be dragged into public scrutiny. It was one of my financial advisors early on. What I believe is that he was getting investigated, and he offered them a bigger fish, which is what they were instructed to get, and suggested that I was the mastermind behind this particular scheme. Paul explained years later, revealing the personal betrayal that had triggered the investigation, and I fell for it hook, line, and sinker, and they started investigating me. The revelation that someone Paul had trusted with his financial security had essentially sold him out to investigators added a devastating personal dimension to what was already a professional nightmare. The man who had built his career on authentic relationships and genuine trust was learning the hard way that success makes you a target for those willing to sacrifice loyalty for their own protection. As the investigation intensified, Paul realized he was facing something far more serious than routine tax compliance issues. This was a battle for his reputation, his freedom, and his very identity as an Australian icon. The country that had once celebrated his success was now determined to destroy him, and he was utterly unprepared for the viciousness of the assault that was about to begin. Chapter 2: The Accusations Explode. The transformation of Paul Hogan from national hero to public enemy number one happened with breathtaking speed once the tax investigation became public knowledge. What had been conducted in relative secrecy suddenly exploded across newspaper headlines, television news reports, and radio talk shows, turning Australia's most beloved entertainer into the most controversial figure in the country. The ATO alleges he owes millions of dollars of unpaid taxes relating to his Crocodile Dundee franchise, became the standard opening line for news reports that painted Paul as a wealthy celebrity trying to cheat the very system that had enabled his extraordinary success. The complexity of international entertainment finance was lost in simplified narratives that reduced decades of legitimate business arrangements to apparent tax evasion schemes. The media feeding frenzy was unlike anything Paul had experienced during his decades in the public eye. Reporters who had once celebrated his achievements now dissected every aspect of his financial life with the enthusiasm of investigators pursuing a major criminal. Privacy became a luxury he could no longer afford, as every transaction, every investment, every business decision was subjected to public scrutiny and criticism. Yeah, it did make me angry, Paul admitted years later, his voice still carrying the raw emotion of those dark days. I might want to thump somebody, so I haven't really got it out of my system yet. The man who had charmed the world with his easygoing humor was discovering reserves of anger and bitterness that threatened to consume everything he had built. The accusations centered around allegations that Paul had deliberately structured his finances to avoid paying his fair share of Australian taxes on the enormous profits from the Crocodile Dundee franchise. The ATO claimed that through a complex web of offshore entities and tax haven arrangements, Paul had effectively hidden tens of millions of dollars from Australian tax authorities, but the investigation went far beyond simple tax avoidance allegations. Prosecutors suggested that Paul had been the mastermind of an elaborate scheme involving multiple parties, complex financial instruments, and deliberate deception designed to defraud the Australian government of revenue that was rightfully owed. The $180 million figure that emerged in media reports was staggering in its implications. This wasn't just about unpaid taxes, this was about penalties, interest, and additional charges that suggested Paul had been engaged in systematic fraud for years. If the allegations were proven, he faced not just financial ruin but potential criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The personal cost of the scandal extended far beyond Paul himself. His family members found themselves subjected to intense scrutiny and media harassment. His children had to defend their father's reputation at school and in social situations where his name had become synonymous with controversy rather than entertainment. It was hard for all my kids then thrust into a limelight that they didn't invite. Paul reflected on how the scandal affected his family. And then everything became, "Oh, is he really your father?" The children who had once been proud to carry the Hogan name now found it a burden that attracted unwanted attention and uncomfortable questions. The scandal also poisoned Paul's relationships within the entertainment industry. Colleagues who had once competed to work with Australia's biggest star suddenly found reasons to distance themselves from someone whose reputation had become toxic. Projects were cancelled, opportunities disappeared, and longtime professional relationships ended without explanation. Public opinion, which had been overwhelmingly positive throughout Paul's career, began to shift dramatically. The tall poppy syndrome that characterizes Australian culture seemed to manifest with particular vengeance against someone who had achieved such extraordinary international success. Citizens who had once celebrated Paul's achievements now questioned whether his success had been built on cheating the system they all supported. Even my mom would say, "Well, you're in trouble with the tax department. Well, you must have done something wrong." Paul recalled with obvious pain, "I didn't do anything." Well, where there's smoke, there's fire. And that's my mother. The betrayal of public trust was devastating enough, but losing the confidence of his own family members added a personal dimension to the scandal that cut deeper than any professional setback. The investigation's scope continued to expand, encompassing not just Paul's own finances, but those of everyone associated with the Crocodile Dundee franchise. Business partners, investors, financial advisors, and even family members found themselves subjected to scrutiny as investigators built what they hoped would be an airtight case against Australia's fallen hero. Legal expenses began mounting at an alarming rate as Paul assembled teams of lawyers, accountants, and financial experts to defend against allegations that threatened not just his wealth but his freedom. The man who had once joked about his humble origins as a bridge worker was now spending millions of dollars on legal representation in a battle that would determine whether he would end his life in prison. The psychological toll was enormous. Paul went from being someone who could walk freely through any Australian city as a beloved celebrity to someone who couldn't appear in public without triggering controversy and confrontation. The easy confidence that had characterized his entire public persona began to crack under the pressure of constant scrutiny and criticism. As the scandal deepened, Paul realized he was fighting for more than just his financial security or legal freedom. He was fighting for his very identity as an Australian and his legacy as someone who had brought joy and pride to millions of people around the world. The country that had once claimed him as their greatest cultural export was now determined to destroy him, and he was running out of allies willing to stand by him in his darkest hour. Chapter 3: Betrayal and Legal Warfare. The most devastating aspect of Paul Hogan's legal nightmare wasn't the government's pursuit of him, but the personal betrayals that had made that pursuit possible. The revelation that people he had trusted with his most intimate financial secrets had essentially sold him out to investigators added a profound sense of personal violation to what was already a professional catastrophe. "It was one of my financial advisors early on," Paul explained with obvious bitterness. "What I believe is that he was getting investigated, and he offered them a bigger fish, which is what they were instructed to get, and suggested that I was the mastermind behind this particular scheme." The realization that someone he had relied upon for financial guidance had betrayed that trust to save himself was almost as devastating as the investigation itself. This betrayal revealed the ugly reality of how white-collar investigations often work. Rather than focusing on genuine wrongdoing, investigators frequently use pressure tactics to turn associates against each other, creating cases where none existed and destroying relationships that had been built over decades of mutual trust and cooperation. The legal warfare that followed was unlike anything Paul had experienced in his decades of dealing with entertainment industry contracts and disputes. This was existential combat where losing meant not just financial ruin but potential imprisonment and the complete destruction of his reputation and legacy. Paul's legal team faced the enormous challenge of defending against allegations that had been years in the making and were supported by thousands of documents, hundreds of witnesses, and the full investigative power of the Australian government. The complexity of international entertainment finance meant that even legitimate arrangements could be made to appear suspicious when viewed through the lens of investigators determined to build a case. The prosecution's strategy seemed designed to overwhelm Paul with the sheer volume of allegations and evidence, hoping to force a settlement rather than risk the expense and uncertainty of a prolonged trial. Every financial transaction spanning decades was scrutinized for evidence of criminal intent, turning routine business decisions into apparently damning evidence of systematic fraud. "I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence," Paul would later point out, highlighting one of the most troubling aspects of the entire affair. Despite years of investigation and millions of dollars spent on building a case, prosecutors never felt confident enough in their evidence to bring criminal charges. Yet the investigation and media coverage proceeded as if Paul's licks had already been established. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the legal combat. Paul found himself subjected to departure prohibition orders that prevented him from leaving Australia, effectively making him a prisoner in his own country. On Friday, the 17-year-old returned to Sydney and was served with the departure prohibition the night before his mother's funeral. Paul recalled about one of the most traumatic moments of the entire ordeal. The timing of this restriction was particularly cruel, preventing Paul from attending his mother's funeral because of technical legal requirements that had nothing to do with the substance of the allegations against him. The bureaucratic cruelty of the system was becoming as devastating as the financial and reputational damage. Legal expenses mounted at an astronomical rate as Paul's defense team worked to counter allegations that seemed to expand and evolve constantly. What had begun as a tax dispute had grown into a multifaceted investigation involving multiple government agencies, international jurisdictions, and complex financial instruments that required expert analysis and testimony. The emotional toll on Paul was severe. The man who had built his career on natural confidence and easy charm found himself constantly on the defensive, unable to enjoy the success he had worked so hard to achieve and uncertain about whether he would retain his freedom or his financial security. The investigation's impact on Paul's family relationships was particularly devastating. Adult children found themselves questioned about their father's business affairs, creating tension and suspicion where there had once been trust and support. The scandal was tearing apart not just Paul's public reputation but his most intimate personal relationships. Professional relationships that had sustained Paul's career for decades began to crumble under the pressure of association with someone whose name had become synonymous with controversy. Business partners distanced themselves, projects were canceled, and opportunities evaporated as the entertainment industry concluded that association with Paul Hogan had become too risky. The media coverage intensified the legal pressure by creating a public perception of guilt that made fair treatment increasingly difficult. Every court appearance became a media circus, every legal filing generated new headlines, and every development in the case was analyzed through the lens of celebrity scandal rather than legal substance. International travel, which had been a normal part of Paul's life and career, became increasingly restricted as various governments responded to requests for cooperation from Australian authorities. The freedom of movement that Paul had enjoyed as a global celebrity was gradually being stripped away as the legal net tightened around him. The investigation's duration, stretching across multiple years, was itself a form of punishment that destroyed Paul's ability to plan his future or maintain his career. No one wanted to work with someone whose legal status remained uncertain, and no one could predict when or how the investigation might finally be resolved. As the legal warfare continued, Paul realized that regardless of the eventual outcome, his life would never be the same. The investigation had already achieved what prosecutors might have intended: the complete destruction of his reputation, the dissolution of his business relationships, and the transformation of Australia's most beloved entertainer into one of its most controversial figures. Chapter 4: The Media Crucifixion. The transformation of Paul Hogan from beloved national icon to media target represented one of the most vicious examples of how quickly public opinion can turn against even the most cherished celebrity. The same media outlets that had spent decades celebrating his achievements now competed to deliver the most damaging coverage of his alleged crimes, creating a feeding frenzy that destroyed what remained of his public reputation. The coverage was relentless and merciless. Every aspect of Paul's life, from his humble beginnings as a bridge worker to his spectacular success with Crocodile Dundee, was re-examined through the lens of the tax scandal. Previously positive stories about his rise to fame were reframed as evidence of a calculating opportunist who had always been motivated by greed rather than genuine talent or authentic character. Television news programs that had once featured Paul as a success story now invited tax experts, legal analysts, and former colleagues to speculate about his guilt and discuss the implications of his alleged crimes. The presumption of innocence, supposedly a cornerstone of the legal system, seemed to have been abandoned in favor of sensational coverage that treated Paul's guilt as already established. Newspaper headlines screamed accusations in language designed to maximize shock and outrage, rather than inform the public about the complex legal and financial issues actually involved in the case. Hogan's tax scandal, Dundee Dodger, and Crocodile Crook became standard descriptions for someone who had never been convicted of any crime. The tabloid coverage was particularly vicious, combining legitimate reporting about the investigation with speculation, rumor, and character assassination that went far beyond the actual allegation. Paul's personal life, his relationships, his spending habits, and his lifestyle choices were all subjected to scrutiny and criticism as if they were relevant to the tax investigation. "Yeah, it did make me angry," Paul admitted when asked about the media coverage years later. "I might want to thump somebody, so I haven't really got it out of my system yet." The easygoing humor that had characterized his public persona for decades was being replaced by bitterness and resentment at treatment he considered fundamentally unfair. The coverage created a feedback loop that intensified the investigation itself. Media attention generated political pressure on investigators to pursue the case aggressively, while new developments in the investigation provided fresh material for media coverage. Paul found himself trapped in a cycle where each element reinforced and amplified the others. International media picked up the story with enthusiasm, presenting it as evidence of how celebrity privilege and wealth corruption had infected even supposedly egalitarian Australia. Paul's global reputation, built through decades of positive international coverage, was being systematically destroyed by reports that focused exclusively on the scandal while ignoring his actual contributions to entertainment and Australian culture. The psychological impact of the media coverage was devastating for someone who had spent his entire career maintaining positive relationships with journalists and entertainment reporters. Paul went from being someone who enjoyed media attention to someone who dreaded every phone call, every unexpected visit, and every public appearance that might generate negative coverage. The coverage also affected Paul's family members, who found themselves subjected to media scrutiny simply because of their relationship to someone who had become controversial. Children and relatives had to endure questions, comments, and criticism from people who assumed Paul's guilt based on media reports rather than actual evidence. Social media amplified the negative coverage exponentially, creating echo chambers where accusations were repeated and embellished without regard for accuracy or fairness. Paul's name became associated with tax evasion and celebrity corruption in online discussions that reached far beyond traditional media audiences. The financial impact of the negative coverage was immediate and severe. Endorsement deals were canceled, appearance opportunities disappeared, and future projects were indefinitely postponed as companies and organizations concluded that association with Paul had become too risky for their own reputation. Former colleagues and friends found themselves forced to choose between loyalty to Paul and their own career interests. Many chose to distance themselves publicly while privately maintaining that they didn't believe the accusation. The result was a profound sense of isolation for someone who had built his career on genuine relationships and mutual respect. The coverage seemed designed more to destroy Paul's reputation than to inform the public about the actual legal issues involved in the case. Complex financial arrangements were simplified into apparent criminal conspiracies, legitimate business practices were characterized as deliberate fraud, and technical tax disputes were presented as evidence of moral corruption. Perhaps most damaging was the way the coverage poisoned Paul's relationship with his Australian audience. The same people who had once celebrated his success as a reflection of their own values now saw him as someone who had betrayed those values by allegedly cheating the system they all supported. The cultural connection that had made Paul such an effective entertainer was being systematically destroyed by coverage that portrayed him as fundamentally different from and superior to ordinary Australian. As the media crucifixion continued, Paul realized that regardless of the legal outcome, his reputation would never fully recover. The damage being done to his public image was irreversible, creating a legacy of scandal and controversy that would overshadow his actual achievements for the rest of his life. Chapter 5: Family Destruction and Personal Hell. While the public watched Paul Hogan's professional reputation crumble under the weight of scandal and investigation, the private devastation occurring within his family was even more heartbreaking. The tax battle that dominated headlines represented only the visible portion of a personal catastrophe that was destroying the most important relationships in Paul's life and leaving him increasingly isolated from the people he loved most. The investigation's impact on Paul's marriage to Linda Kozlowski was particularly devastating. Their relationship, which had already been strained by the pressures of fame and the demands of maintaining careers in different countries, couldn't withstand the additional stress of constant legal scrutiny and media harassment. The couple, who had once embodied Hollywood romance, found themselves living separate lives while lawyers fought battles that threatened their financial security and personal freedom. Linda gradually lost her sense of belonging in her own home, observed those close to the couple during this difficult period. Conversations became rare, and the mutual understanding they once shared dissolved. The investigation created an atmosphere of suspicion and stress that poisoned even the most intimate moments of their relationship. Linda, who had sacrificed her own career ambitions to support Paul's success, now found herself trapped in a marriage that offered neither security nor happiness. The tax investigation meant that their assets were frozen, their travel was restricted, and their future was uncertain in ways that made long-term planning impossible. The strain on their relationship manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways. Public appearances became exercises in maintaining facades rather than genuine expressions of affection. The easy chemistry that had made their on-screen romance so compelling was replaced by tension and distance that even casual observers could detect. By 2013, after years of unsuccessful attempts to salvage their marriage, Linda Kozlowski officially filed for divorce at the Los Angeles Superior Court, marking the end of more than 2 decades together. The reason she cited was irreconcilable differences, a familiar legal phrase but one that concealed years of emotional pain and unmet needs. For Paul, now 74 years old and dealing with serious health issues in addition to his legal problems, the divorce represented the loss of the most important relationship in his life. The woman who had stood by him through his greatest triumphs was unable to remain through his greatest crisis, leaving him to face an uncertain future alone. Although the divorce was amicable, for Paul Hogan it was a profound shock, reflected those who witnessed the end of the marriage. Losing the woman who had been by his side for over 2 decades was a loss he struggled to come to terms with. The man who had once charmed audiences worldwide was discovering that private pain was immune to public charm. The impact on Paul's relationship with his children was equally devastating. Adult children found themselves caught between loyalty to their father and their own need to protect their families and careers from association with scandal. The investigation created divisions and tensions that tested even the strongest family bonds. It was hard for all my kids, then thrust into a limelight that they didn't invite. Paul had observed about how his fame affected his children, and then everything became, "Oh, is he really your father?" The tax scandal intensified these pressures exponentially, turning casual questions into accusations and making his children defensive about their family connection. Some family members found themselves questioned by investigators about their knowledge of Paul's business affairs, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that made normal family interactions increasingly difficult. Holiday gatherings became tense affairs where everyone was careful about what they said and whom they said it to. The financial restrictions imposed during the investigation affected not just Paul but family members who depended on him for support or who had investments connected to his business empire. Adult children saw their own financial security threatened by legal battles they couldn't control or fully understand.
Paul's health problems.
including the muscle atrophy that was gradually weakening his body, made the emotional stress of the investigation even more devastating. The man who had once been known for his physical vitality and natural confidence was becoming frail and uncertain in ways that alarmed everyone who cared about him. Paul developed muscle atrophy. His arms weakened, his steps slowed, described those who observed his physical decline during this period. But the deepest pain was not physical, it was emotional. The investigation was literally consuming Paul's strength and vitality along with his reputation and relationships. The isolation became increasingly complete as Paul realized that maintaining relationships put other people at risk of being dragged into the investigation. Friends and family members faced impossible choices between supporting someone they loved and protecting themselves from legal and financial consequences they couldn't afford. Paul's own emotional state became increasingly fragile as the investigation dragged on year after year without resolution. The man who had built his career on optimism and humor found himself struggling with depression, anger, and a growing sense that the life he had built was being systematically destroyed by forces beyond his control. He refused every introduction, every possibility of new affection, noted those who tried to help Paul rebuild his personal life after the divorce. The investigation had created such profound trust issues that Paul found himself unable to form new relationships or even maintain many existing ones. The personal hell that Paul was experiencing was largely invisible to the public, who saw only the headlines about tax investigations and legal battles. But for someone who had always valued authentic relationships and genuine human connection above fame or fortune, the destruction of his family life represented a deeper tragedy than any financial or legal setback could ever be. Chapter 6: The Years in Exile. By 2014, Paul Hogan had become a stranger in his own land. The country that had once celebrated him as its greatest cultural export now felt hostile and unwelcoming, filled with reporters seeking scandals, investigators pursuing allegations, and citizens who looked at him with suspicion rather than admiration. The decision to leave Australia wasn't really a choice, it was the only way to escape the suffocating atmosphere of controversy that had made normal life impossible. The move to permanent residence in the United States represented more than just a change of address. It was an acknowledgement that Paul's relationship with Australia had been irreparably damaged by years of investigation and media coverage. The man who had once embodied Australian values and character for international audiences now felt like an exile from the very culture he had helped define. What am I gonna do? Flee, go change my name and get plastic surgery and live in South America? Paul had joked bitterly during the worst period of the investigation, but the reality of his situation was almost as extreme. While he didn't need to change his identity, he did need to rebuild his life in a country where his name wasn't automatically associated with scandal and controversy. Los Angeles became Paul's refuge, offering the anonymity that was impossible in Australia along with access to the entertainment industry connections he needed to maintain what remained of his career. But the Hollywood that welcomed him in exile was very different from the one that had celebrated him at the height of his success. The entertainment industry's attitude toward Paul had fundamentally changed during the years of investigation and scandal. Studios and production companies that had once competed for his participation now viewed him as a liability whose involvement could attract unwanted attention and negative publicity. Projects that might have been automatic approvals became complicated negotiations involving insurance concerns and public relations calculations. Paul leads a pretty calm existence now. He's single. He pretty much described those who observed his life during the exile year. The vibrant social personality that had characterized Paul throughout his career was replaced by a more withdrawn and cautious approach to public engagement. The man who had once thrived on attention now sought privacy and anonymity. The health issues that had begun during the investigation continued to worsen during the exile years. Paul's muscle atrophy progressed, affecting his mobility and energy levels in ways that made the physically demanding aspects of entertainment work increasingly difficult. The stress and isolation of his situation likely accelerated his physical decline. Paul developed muscle atrophy, his arms weakened, his steps slowed, described those who witnessed his deterioration during this period. But the deepest pain was not physical, it was emotional. The combination of health problems, legal stress, and social isolation created a downward spiral that threatened to consume what remained of his vitality and purpose. The financial cost of the exile was enormous. Maintaining residences in multiple countries, paying ongoing legal expenses, and supporting family members who remained in Australia required resources that had been dramatically reduced by the investigation's impact on his earning capacity. The man who had once been among Australia's wealthiest entertainers found himself carefully managing expenses in ways he had never needed to consider. Professional opportunities during the exile years were limited and often involved projects that were far beneath Paul's previous standard. Directors like Dean Murphy offered roles that acknowledged Paul's age and physical limitations while trying to reconnect him with Australian audiences who might be willing to forgive past controversy. I think the great thing about the movies that he made with Dean Murphy was that Paul Hogan had then gotten a little bit older and he played roles that were age-appropriate. Observed those involved in these later projects. Films like Strange Bedfellows and Charlie and Boots represented attempts to rebuild Paul's career on more modest foundations that matched his changed circumstances. But even these smaller projects carried emotional weight that went beyond their commercial significance. Working in Australia required Paul to confront the changes in how he was perceived by crews, colleagues, and audiences who had once treated him as a beloved icon. The easy camaraderie that had characterized his early career was replaced by a more formal and sometimes uncomfortable professional distance. He was such a low-key, easy, gallant sort of guy, recalled director Dean Murphy about working with Paul during this period. I thought, yeah, I could work with this guy, it'll be no problem. But the underlying sadness and weariness that Paul carried were evident to those who worked closely with him. The isolation from family and friends was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the exile year. Paul's children remained primarily in Australia, making regular contact difficult and limiting his involvement in their daily lives. The grandchildren, who might have provided comfort and purpose in his later years, were growing up largely without his presence. Sometimes people caught sight of Paul quietly tearing old letters or smiling faintly at old photographs, described those who observed him during private moments. Simple moments that had become nothing more than memory. The exile had transformed Paul from someone who lived fully in the present to someone who existed primarily in the past. The psychological adaptation to exile was complicated by the knowledge that returning to Australia remained legally and practically difficult. Even after the investigation was resolved, the media attention and public controversy that would accompany any return made the prospect unappealing. Paul found himself trapped between a homeland that had rejected him and an adopted country that would never fully accept him. The years in exile fundamentally changed Paul's relationship with his own legacy and achievements. The success that had once been a source of pride and satisfaction now felt distant and somehow tainted by everything that had followed. The man who had created one of entertainment's most beloved characters was struggling to find meaning and purpose in his own life story. Chapter 7: The Settlement and Hollow Victory. After 8 years of legal warfare that had consumed millions of dollars, destroyed countless relationships, and devastated Paul Hogan's reputation, the resolution of the tax case arrived not with vindication, but with the hollow satisfaction of a negotiated settlement that satisfied no one and resolved nothing about the fundamental questions of justice and fairness that had defined the entire ordeal. Australian actor Paul Hogan has settled a marathon 8-year tax dispute with the Australian Taxation Office, announced the media in 2010, but the dry language of legal settlements couldn't capture the human cost of what had been endured by all parties involved. The actor says the confidential settlement was reached on a without admission basis. The phrase without admission basis became crucial to understanding the ultimate meaninglessness of the entire investigation. After years of accusations, millions of dollars in legal expenses, and devastating personal consequences, neither side was willing to admit they had been wrong. Paul wasn't admitting guilt, but he also wasn't receiving vindication. "I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence," Paul pointed out with obvious frustration, highlighting the fundamental injustice of an investigation that had destroyed his reputation without ever producing sufficient evidence to support criminal charges. "But I've still got it attached to me that has sort of smirched his reputation, especially in Australia." The settlement amount was never disclosed, but those familiar with the negotiations suggested it represented a fraction of the $80 million originally claimed by the Australian Taxation Office. The reduction from the initial allegations to the final settlement demonstrated how much of the original case had been based on speculation and aggressive interpretation, rather than solid evidence. But the financial resolution, whatever its terms, couldn't address the broader damage that had been done to Paul's life and legacy. The years of investigation had aged him dramatically, destroyed his marriage, strained his family relationships, and transformed him from beloved entertainer to controversial figure in the public imagination. You know, people will just even now sometimes make a crack about it. Paul observed about the lasting impact of the scandal, but it's just, and he doesn't like it. The settlement hadn't restored his reputation or removed the stain of suspicion that would follow him for the rest of his life. The confidential nature of the settlement meant that Paul could never fully defend himself against the original accusation. Without admission of wrongdoing by either party, the public was left to draw their own conclusions based on years of negative media coverage, rather than the actual facts of what had been discovered during the investigation. The hollow nature of the victory was evident in Paul's own reaction to the resolution. Instead of celebration or relief, there was bitterness and exhaustion. The man who had once approached every challenge with humor and optimism was now marked by cynicism and distrust that reflected how profoundly the experience had changed him. The investigation's impact on Paul's relationship with Australian institutions and authorities was permanently damaged. The settlement might have resolved the legal dispute, but it couldn't restore the basic trust between citizen and government that had been shattered by what Paul viewed as persecution disguised as legitimate law enforcement. "Yeah, it did make me angry," Paul admitted when discussing the settlement years later. "I might want to thump somebody, so I haven't really got it out of my system yet." The anger that had sustained him through the worst years of the investigation remained unresolved because the settlement provided no real sense of justice or vindication. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond Paul's personal situation. The investigation represented a disturbing example of how celebrity status could make someone a target for aggressive prosecution, how complex financial arrangements could be criminalized after the fact, and how the legal system could be used to destroy someone's reputation without ever proving actual wrongdoing. Other high-profile Australians watched the Paul Hogan case with growing concern about their own vulnerability to similar treatment. The message seemed clear: success, particularly international success, could make you a target for investigation and persecution regardless of whether you had actually violated any laws. The entertainment industry's response to the settlement was cautiously neutral, with most participants unwilling to comment publicly on a case that had demonstrated how quickly careers could be destroyed by association with controversy. The institutions that had once celebrated Paul's achievements maintained careful distance from someone whose name remained controversial. Paul's attempts to rebuild his career after the settlement were hampered by the ongoing reputational damage and his own physical and emotional exhaustion. The energy and enthusiasm that had once made him irresistible to audiences had been drained by years of legal combat and personal stress. The settlement also failed to address the financial damage that had been done to Paul's estate during the investigation. Legal fees, lost earning opportunities, and the impact on his business relationships had cost him far more than whatever he eventually paid to resolve the tax dispute. Perhaps most tragically, the settlement couldn't restore the relationships that had been damaged or destroyed during the investigation. Paul's marriage was over, his family connections were strained, and many friendships had been casualties of the pressure and suspicion that had surrounded him for years. The hollow victory of the settlement left Paul in a strange position where he was legally free, but practically imprisoned by a reputation that had been permanently damaged by accusations that were never proved. The resolution that was supposed to end his nightmare had instead condemned him to a different kind of purgatory, where he would always be remembered more for the scandal than for the achievements that had made the scandal possible in the first place. Chapter 8. Aftermath and Reflection. In the years following the settlement of his tax case, Paul Hogan found himself existing in a strange twilight zone between vindication and condemnation, freedom and exile, resolution and ongoing torment. The legal battle might have ended, but its consequences continued to shape every aspect of his life in ways that demonstrated how completely the scandal had transformed his existence. The most visible change was in Paul's public presence. which had diminished dramatically from the days when he was one of Australia's most recognizable and celebrated figures. Appearances became rare and carefully managed affairs, often focused on promoting smaller projects that bore little resemblance to the blockbuster success of his previous career. Paul leads a pretty calm existence now. He's single. Observe those who remained in contact with him during this period. The vibrant social personality that had characterized Paul throughout his rise to fame had been replaced by a more withdrawn and cautious approach to public engagement that reflected both his age and his hard-earned wariness about media attention. The health issues that had begun during the investigation continued to worsen in the aftermath of the settlement. Paul's muscle atrophy had progressed to the point where it affected his mobility and daily activities, making the physical demands of entertainment work increasingly challenging. The stress and isolation of his situation had clearly taken a toll on both his physical and mental well-being. Paul has been battling health issues including muscle loss and chronic pain, which have made his daily life increasingly challenging. Describe those who observed his condition during public appearances. In recent public appearances, Paul appears thin and somewhat frail but continues to maintain the optimistic and humorous spirit that once made him a beloved figure. The financial impact of the investigation and settlement extended far beyond the immediate cost. Paul's earning capacity had been permanently diminished by the reputational damage, and his ability to command the fees and opportunities that had once made him wealthy was severely compromised. The man who had once been among Australia's richest entertainers found himself living more modestly and carefully managing resources that had been depleted by years of legal expenses. Professional opportunities remained limited and often involved projects that represented significant compromises from Paul's previous standard. While directors like Dean Murphy continued to offer roles that acknowledged his changed circumstances and physical limitations, these projects could never match the cultural significance or commercial success of his earlier work. The relationship with Australian audiences remained complicated and painful for someone who had once been universally beloved. While some fans remained loyal and supportive, others continued to view Paul with suspicion based on the scandal that had dominated headlines for so many years. The easy affection that had characterized his relationship with the Australian public had been permanently damaged. In spite of once describing his 23-year marriage to Linda as a lonely nightmare, Paul also acknowledged that those years were the most beautiful time of his life. Reflected those who understood the complexity of his feelings about the past. The investigation had forced Paul to confront difficult truths about his life and relationships while also appreciating what he had lost. The isolation from family members who remained in Australia continued to be one of the most painful aspects of Paul's situation. While he maintained relationships with his children, the distance and the lingering effects of the scandal had permanently altered the dynamics of family interactions that had once been sources of strength and support. Although he has lived alone since divorcing Linda Kozlowski in 2014, Paul revealed that he maintains a good relationship with his son Chance Hogan. Noted those who observed his family connections during this period. The father and son often spend time together, sharing simple everyday moments. These relationships provided some comfort, but they couldn't fully compensate for the broader isolation he experienced. The psychological adaptation to his changed circumstances was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Paul's post-scandal life. The man who had built his identity around success, popularity, and public affection had to learn to live with controversies, suspicion, and reduced circumstances that would have been unimaginable at the height of his fame. When asked about his marriage to Linda Kozlowski, Paul admitted, "I loved her deeply, but sometimes love just isn't enough. We tried, but in the end, we couldn't walk the same path." Demonstrated his growing ability to reflect honestly on the choices and circumstances that had shaped his life, including his own role in the relationships that had failed. The broader cultural legacy of Paul's scandal extended far beyond his personal situation. The case had demonstrated how quickly public opinion could turn against even the most beloved figures, how complex financial arrangements could be criminalized through aggressive interpretation, and how the legal system could be used to destroy someone's reputation without ever proving actual wrongdoing. Other public figures studied Paul's case as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability that comes with success and the importance of managing not just business affairs but public relationships. and media coverage. The entertainment industry became more cautious about international financial arrangements and more aware of how political and cultural changes could transform legitimate business practices into apparent criminal conspiracy. Paul's own reflections on the experience were characterized by a mixture of bitterness, resignation, and hard-earned wisdom about the nature of fame, success, and the price of public life. The man who had once approached every challenge with humor and optimism had been forced to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and institutional power. Although no longer actively involved in the entertainment industry, Paul Hogan expressed a desire to complete one final project to thank his fans before officially retiring. Suggested that despite everything he had endured, Paul retained some connection to the values and relationships that had originally motivated his career. The desire to give something back to audiences who had supported him demonstrated that the scandal hadn't completely destroyed his sense of purpose or gratitude. As Paul entered the final phase of his life, the scandal that had dominated so many years remained an unresolved source of pain and frustration. The settlement had ended the legal warfare, but it hadn't provided the vindication or justice that might have allowed him to fully move beyond what had happened. Instead, he remained trapped between a past he couldn't reclaim and a future that would always be shaped by accusations that were never proven but never fully refuted. Epilogue: The Unhealed Wounds. Today, more than a decade after the settlement of his tax case, Paul Hogan remains one of Australian entertainment's most tragic figures, a man whose extraordinary achievements have been permanently overshadowed by a scandal that destroyed everything he had built while never actually proving the accusations that triggered his downfall. At 80, living quietly in Los Angeles with failing health and limited mobility, Paul embodies the devastating consequences of what happens when the machinery of investigation and media coverage combines to destroy someone whose only real crime may have been achieving too much success. Too visible. While time and health may no longer be on his side, Paul Hogan remains a vivid symbol of a golden era, reflects the complex legacy of someone who created lasting joy for millions of people while experiencing profound personal suffering that most of his audience never understood or appreciated. The man who made the world laugh with Crocodile Dundee spent his later years struggling with isolation, health problems, and the bitter knowledge that his reputation would forever be tainted by accusations that were never proven in court. The unresolved nature of the scandal continues to plague Paul's legacy in ways that demonstrate the fundamental unfairness of what was done to him. The settlement that ended the legal warfare provided no vindication for someone who was never actually charged with criminal wrongdoing, leaving him permanently associated with tax evasion and financial corruption in the public imagination despite the lack of evidence to support such accusations. "I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence, but I've still got it attached to me." Paul's observation captures the core injustice of a system that could destroy someone's reputation and life without ever meeting the burden of proof required for actual criminal prosecution. The investigation achieved its destructive purpose without ever having to justify its conclusions in court. The broader implications of Paul's case continue to resonate throughout Australian society and culture. His experience demonstrated how quickly the tall poppy syndrome could transform national heroes into pariahs, how complex financial arrangements could be retroactively criminalized through aggressive interpretation, and how the legal system could be weaponized to destroy someone's life without providing meaningful recourse or compensation. The entertainment industry learned harsh lessons from Paul's downfall about the vulnerability that comes with international success and the importance of managing not just business affairs but political and cultural relationships. Other performers and creators became more cautious about financial arrangements and more aware of how changing political climates could transform legitimate business practices into apparent criminal conspiracy. For Australian culture more broadly, Paul's scandal represented a profound loss of innocence about the relationship between success and persecution. The country that had once celebrated his achievements as a reflection of national pride was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that success, particularly international success, could make someone a target for destruction by the very institutions that were supposed to protect citizens from injustice. The personal cost of the scandal cannot be measured in financial terms alone. Paul lost his marriage, his health, his relationship with his homeland, and many of the friendships and family connections that had sustained him throughout his career. The isolation and bitterness that characterized his later years represented a human tragedy that went far beyond the legal and financial consequences of the investigation. Perhaps most tragically, the scandal overshadowed the genuine achievements that had made Paul a beloved figure in the first place. The joy, laughter, and cultural pride that he had brought to millions of people around the world became secondary to the controversy that dominated his later years. The character of Mick Dundee, which had done so much to present Australia positively to the world, became associated with the scandal that destroyed its creator. The media's role in Paul's destruction remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire affair. The same outlets that had celebrated his success competed to deliver the most damaging coverage of his alleged crimes, creating a feeding frenzy that treated accusations as established facts and destroyed what remained of his public reputation. The presumption of innocence was abandoned in favor of sensational coverage that prioritized entertainment value over fairness or accuracy. The unhealed wounds of Paul's experience continue to affect not just him personally, but everyone who witnessed how quickly a beloved figure could be transformed into a pariah through allegations that were never proved. The case serves as a permanent reminder of the vulnerability that comes with success and the importance of protecting the principles of justice and fairness that are supposed to govern how we treat each other, particularly those who have achieved enough to become targets for envy or political opportunism. As Paul approaches the end of his life, the scandal that defined his later years stands as a monument to institutional failure and cultural cruelty. The country that should have protected its greatest cultural export instead participated in his destruction, teaching future generations that success can be punished as easily as it is celebrated, and that achieving your dreams may simply make you a more visible target for those who want to destroy them. The story of Paul Hogan's scandal is ultimately a story about the price of fame, the cruelty of the system, and the profound injustice that can be inflicted on those who dare to succeed beyond the comfortable mediocrity that often characterizes public life. His unhealed wounds serve as a warning to anyone who might think that talent, achievement, and public service provide protection against the forces that can destroy a life for reasons that have nothing to do with actual wrongdoing and everything to do with the destructive power of envy, politics, and institutional overreach. The man who once made the world believe in the possibility of authentic heroes has become an inadvertent symbol of how those heroes can be destroyed by the very society they serve. Paul Hogan's scandal represents not just a personal tragedy but a cultural failure that should shame everyone who participated in or enabled the destruction of someone whose only real crime was achieving more success than others thought he deserved.